I used to think true camping horror stories were exaggerated. You know the kind, people hearing footsteps in the woods, finding strange markings on trees, swearing someone followed them back from the trail. I'd listen to those scary camping experiences and think, yeah, sure, probably just a raccoon or their own paranoia getting the best of them. Then I met Daniel at Blackpine Ridge, and I stopped being skeptical. This happened 3 years ago, late October. I'd gone solo camping in the Cascades, a 4-day trip to a spot I'd hiked maybe a dozen times before. Remote enough that you'd rarely see another soul, which was exactly what I wanted. I arrived just before sunset on a Thursday, set up my tent near the eastern edge of the clearing, and started my fire as the light drained from the sky. I was heating water for dinner when I heard boots crunching through the underbrush. He appeared at the edge of the firelight like he'd materialized from the trees themselves. Tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing a faded jacket and carrying a pack that looked barely used. He stopped a respectful distance away and raised one hand in greeting. Said his name was Daniel. Said he was camping about a quarter-mile north, saw my smoke, thought he'd introduce himself since we were neighbors out here. I appreciated that he kept his distance. Didn't step into my camp uninvited. Didn't linger too long either. We talked for maybe 10 minutes, surface stuff, trail conditions, weather forecast. He mentioned he'd been coming to Blackpine for years, loved the solitude. Then he wished me a good evening and disappeared back into the dark. Polite, normal, forgettable, except he wasn't. The next morning, I woke at dawn like I always do. Made coffee, ate a granola bar. Around 7:30, I grabbed my water bottles and headed down to the creek, same routine I follow on every camping trip I've ever taken. The creek was maybe 200 yards south through a stand of Douglas firs. I was kneeling by the water, filling my second bottle, when I heard that voice again. Daniel was standing about 20 feet upstream, filling his own canteen. He smiled and said good morning. Said he figured I'd be an early riser, something about the way I'd set up my camp the night before. Said he was the same way, couldn't sleep past sunrise if he tried. Strange thing to notice, but I let it slide. Back at camp, I spent the morning reading and relaxing. Around 11, I decided to check the trail junction to the west. There was a shortcut I wanted to scout for the hike back. I'd been walking maybe 5 minutes when I spotted him again, coming from the opposite direction on the same trail. He seemed surprised to see me. Said he was just stretching his legs, getting to know the area better. But here's what bothered me. He'd said his camp was north. The trail junction was west, and he was coming from the south. I started paying attention after that. That afternoon, I reorganized my gear, checked my map. Around 3 o'clock, I went back to the creek for more water. I drink a lot when I'm hiking, always have. And there he was again, just finishing up like he'd timed it perfectly. He laughed when he saw me. Said we were really in sync out here, running the same schedule. Said he was good at reading people, always had been. Could usually predict what someone would do before they did it. The way he said it wasn't threatening. It was casual, almost proud, but something in my gut twisted sideways. I changed my routine after that. Waited until almost sunset to get water. Skipped my usual evening walk around the perimeter. Stayed close to the fire, kept my headlamp on, tried to look busy. He didn't show up again that day. The third morning, I woke around 6 and decided I'd had enough. I'd cut the trip short, pack up after breakfast, be gone by noon. I was stuffing my sleeping bag when I realized I'd left my trail map outside the night before, weighted down with a rock near the fire pit. I want to grab it. And that's when everything real and terrifying about camping alone in the wilderness came into perfect horrible focus. The map had been unfolded. Someone had written on it, in pencil along the margin, a list of times. 7:30 a.m., creek. 11 a.m., trail junction. 3 p.m., creek. 5:45 p.m., perimeter walk. 9:30 p.m., fire out. The first 4 had neat lines struck through them. The perimeter walk wasn't crossed out. I hadn't done it yesterday. And at the bottom, circled twice in heavy graphite. 6:15 a.m., restroom trail. I checked my watch. It was 6:12. The restroom trail was just a narrow path I'd been using, about 70 yards northeast into the trees, far enough from camp for privacy. I went there every morning like clockwork, usually right after I woke up. I hadn't gone yet. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the map. I looked around the clearing, at the wall of trees pressing in from every side, and understood with perfect clarity that someone had been watching me for days. recording my movements, learning my patterns, predicting exactly when I'd be alone, away from the fire, away from my gear, vulnerable in the woods with my back turned. And I had 3 minutes before I would have walked right into whatever he had planned. I didn't scream, didn't run. I backed toward my tent, grabbed my knife from the side pocket, and stood with my spine against a tree where I could see the whole clearing. 6:15 came and went. Nothing happened. The forest was silent except for the wind moving through the branches and the distant sound of the creek. I waited there for 20 minutes, knife in hand, watching the restroom trail, watching the trees, watching for any sign of movement. Nothing. At 6:40, I started packing with frantic speed, throwing everything into my bag, not bothering to fold or organize. I kicked dirt over the fire pit, hoisted my pack, started moving toward the main trail. I was maybe halfway to the trailhead when I saw the second thing that still wakes me up some nights. Tucked under a fallen log, maybe 10 feet off the path, was a small camp setup. A tarp lean-to, a sleeping bag, a backpack. But it wasn't arranged like someone was actually staying there. It was a blind, a hunting blind, positioned with a perfect sight line to the restroom trail. I ran the last 2 miles to my car without stopping. Later, much later, after I'd gotten home and finally worked up the nerve, I reported it to the ranger station. Gave them the location, described Daniel, told them about the map and the times and the blind in the woods. They took my statement seriously, said they'd increase patrols in the area. But here's the thing they told me that I can't stop thinking about. They said this wasn't the first report they'd received from Black Pine Ridge. Over the past 18 months, there had been 3 other incidents. Solo campers, all women, who'd reported feeling watched, being followed, finding evidence that someone had been near their camps while they were away. And every single one of them had mentioned a man who introduced himself politely. A man who was good at reading people. A man named Daniel. But when rangers searched the area each time, they never found any trace of him. No camp. No footprints. Nothing. Like he just disappeared back into the trees or something. I haven't been camping alone since. Probably never will again. Because I know now that the scariest camping stories aren't about creatures in the dark or supernatural things lurking in the forest. They're about people who know exactly when you'll be vulnerable. People who study you. People who wait. And the worst part, the part that keeps me looking over my shoulder even now, 3 years later, is that I never found out what was supposed to happen at 6:15 that morning. Because I made one mistake before I left Black Pine Ridge that day. After I found the hunting blind, after I ran to my car and locked the doors and sat there shaking for 20 minutes before I could even turn the key, I realized I'd left something behind. My water bottle. The one I'd filled at the creek that last morning. I didn't go back for it. Told myself it didn't matter. I could buy another one. No way was I setting foot in those woods again. But 2 days later, a hiker found it on the restroom trail. Sitting upright on a flat rock. Perfectly placed, impossible to miss. The ranger who called me said they'd sent it to a lab, just routine, checking for anything unusual. They found something inside. Not in the water itself, that had been poured out. Scratched into the plastic on the inside of the bottle, like someone had used a nail or a sharp stick, were words. Tiny letters, almost invisible unless you held it up to the light at just the right angle. The ranger read them to me over the phone. You changed your pattern. Smart. But patterns always come back. See you next time. They asked if I wanted the bottle returned. I said no. Here's what I never told the rangers, though. What I couldn't explain because it didn't make sense. When I ran past that hunting blind, curiosity got the best of me. I just couldn't help it. So I came back to take a look and I saw something. A notebook. Open. Pages covered in handwriting. And at the top of the visible page, a name. Not mine. My sister's. The one person who knew I was at Black Pine that week. The one person I'd told my exact location. She's been camping there since Thursday. I've been camping my whole life. Dozens of trips. Hundreds of nights under canvas. I thought I'd seen every weird thing the woods could throw at me. But this was different. Let me tell you about last September. About my best friend Mikey. About what happened on what was supposed to be a simple weekend trip to Choco National Forest. Mikey and I had been friends since middle school. 15 years of knowing someone inside and out. I'd seen him drunk, heartbroken, scared, everything. And in all those years, through sleepovers and road trips and college dorm rooms, he had never once walked in his sleep. Not once. We picked a campsite 3 miles off the main trail. Deep enough to feel isolated, but not so far we'd die if something went wrong. The first day was perfect. We fished, set up camp, cooked over the fire. Mikey seemed relaxed for the first time in months. His job had been crushing him, and he needed this. That first night, I woke up to the sound of the tent zipper. The slow metallic hiss of it opening, tooth by tooth. I checked my phone. 2:37 a.m. I sat up and saw Mikey crawling out through the flap, still in his sleeping bag liner, moving in that strange fluid way that doesn't look quite human in the dark. I called his name. He didn't respond. Just kept moving until he was standing about 20 feet from the tent, facing the tree line. Standing completely still. I grabbed my flashlight and went after him. When I reached him, his eyes were half open but unfocused. Sleepwalking. Had to be. I'd heard you weren't supposed to wake sleepwalkers suddenly, so I gently guided him back to the tent. He came willingly like a child. In the morning, he had no memory of it. We laughed it off. Stress does weird things to people. Maybe his body was just processing, releasing something. Those kinds of outdoor experiences can be unsettling even when nothing goes wrong. But the second night, it happened again. This time I woke to find him already gone. I unzipped the tent and saw him much farther away, maybe 50 yards into the woods. And he wasn't just standing there. He was whispering. I couldn't make out the words at first. Just this low, continuous murmur, like he was having a conversation. I crept closer, branches snapping under my feet, and he didn't react at all. Didn't turn around. Didn't acknowledge me. When I got close enough, I heard him clearly. He was responding to questions, pausing like someone was speaking to him, then answering, nodding his head. At one point he even laughed this soft, agreeable laugh. But there was nobody there. Just Mikey. Just the trees. Just the suffocating darkness of the forest pressing in from all sides. I said his name, louder this time. He stopped mid-sentence and turned to look at me, but his eyes were still that same glazed-over nothing. I walked him back to camp, and the whole way he was compliant, docile, like I was leading a stranger wearing my best friend's face. The next morning, I noticed the dirt, packed deep under his fingernails, ground into the creases of his palms. When I asked him about it, he looked genuinely confused. Said he didn't remember leaving the tent at all. I should have packed up right then. Should have driven us both back to civilization. But Mikey insisted he was fine. Said we'd driven 4 hours to get here, and he wasn't going to let a little sleepwalking ruin the trip. He seemed so normal in the daylight, joking, cooking breakfast, talking about work like nothing had happened. So we stayed. The third night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to Mikey breathe beside me, waiting. At 2:43 a.m., the zipper opened. I didn't move, didn't call out. I just watched through barely open eyes as Mikey crawled out into the night. This time, I was going to follow him. I waited a full minute before unzipping my side of the tent. He was already deep in the woods, moving with that same strange purpose. I kept my flashlight off and used the moonlight to track him. He walked for what felt like forever, past the creek, past the boulder formation we'd used as a landmark, into a part of the forest we hadn't explored. And then he stopped. I crouched behind a fallen log about 30 feet away and watched. Mikey stood in a small clearing, head tilted like he was listening. And then he started talking again. But this time I heard what he was responding to. A voice was calling instructions. A voice that sounded like mine. I heard myself telling him where to stand. Heard myself asking him questions. But I was right here, pressed against this rotting log, my hand clamped over my mouth to keep from screaming. Mikey nodded and stepped forward, turned left, took 3 steps back, following directions precisely. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and shouted his name. Mikey froze. His head snapped toward me, and for the first time in 3 nights, his eyes focused. Actually focused. And what I saw there wasn't confusion. It was terror. He started backing away from me, hands up like I was a threat. He was saying something over and over. At first I couldn't make it out over the sound of blood pounding in my ears, but then I heard it clearly. You told me where to stand. You told me where to stand. You've been telling me every night. I tried to approach him, tried to explain that I'd been in the tent, that whatever he'd heard wasn't me. but he just kept backing away until he turned and ran. I chased him back to camp, but by the time I got there, he was already in the tent, facing the wall, refusing to speak to me. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. Neither of us. When dawn finally broke, I needed to clear my head. I walked the perimeter of our campsite, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. That's when I found the footprints. 2 sets, leading away from our tent into the woods. I followed them to where Mikey had been standing, to that clearing, and then I followed them back. Only 1 set of prints returned to camp. I stood there, staring at those tracks in the dirt, trying to understand. If Mikey's prints came back, whose didn't? We broke camp in silence. Mikey wouldn't look at me, wouldn't speak. He just packed his gear with mechanical precision, hands shaking so badly he could barely roll his sleeping bag. The drive back should have taken 4 hours. We made it in 3. I dropped him at his apartment, and he got out without a word. Didn't even grab his camping gear from the back. Just walked inside and locked the door behind him. Mikey didn't return my calls. Didn't respond to texts. His social media went dark 3 weeks after we got back. I drove by his apartment thrice, and his car was gone all 3 times. His sister finally called me after about a month. Said Mikey had a breakdown. That he kept insisting someone had been impersonating me in the woods. That he'd been taking instructions from something that wore my voice like a mask. She asked if I knew what he was talking about. I told her no. But I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. I went back to that campsite the next day after the call. Alone. Stupid, I know. But I needed to see it again in the daylight. Needed to prove to myself it had all been stress or exhaustion or some shared delusion brought on by isolation. I found the clearing. And I found something else. Pressed into the soft earth near where Mikey had been standing. Another set of prints. Deeper than the others. Older. Leading away from the clearing in a 3rd direction entirely. The tread pattern was identical to my hiking boots. But I'd never walked in that direction. Never stood in that spot. I traced those prints for nearly a mile before they just stopped. Right in the middle of the trail. Like whatever made them had simply lifted off the ground. Or had never been walking at all. I haven't been camping since. Mikey moved away 3 months ago. Didn't tell anyone where. Sometimes I wonder if he's still following instructions somewhere out there in the woods. And sometimes I wonder whose footprints really came back to camp that morning. If these stories are creeping you out, subscribe. The horror isn't over. I need to tell you about what happened to me last October in the Cascade Wilderness, because what I thought was a rescue mission turned into something I still can't fully explain. And honestly, if you're into true camping horror stories, this one's going to stick with you. I'd been planning that solo trip for months. 3 days, deep backcountry, just me and my gear. I'm not some amateur either. I've been camping since I was 12, always prepared, always careful. My pack had everything, including a personal locator beacon, the kind that sends out distress signals to satellites if you're in real trouble. The first day was perfect. I hiked 8 miles to a clearing I'd marked on my map, set up camp before sunset, cooked my freeze-dried meal over a small fire. The forest was quiet in that way that feels peaceful. At least it was. Around 11 p.m., I heard it. A sharp, rhythmic beeping. 3 short bursts. Pause. 3 more bursts. The universal distress signal. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. It came from somewhere west of my camp, maybe a quarter mile out. My first thought was that someone had activated their emergency beacon, that they were hurt and needed help. The sound was clear enough to follow, distant but distinct. I grabbed my headlamp, my knife, my first aid kit, left my beacon clipped to my pack where it always stayed, started moving toward the sound. The forest at night is a different animal. My headlamp carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, and every step felt like I was pushing deeper into something that didn't want me there. But someone needed help, or so I thought. The beeping continued. 3 bursts, pause. 3 bursts. I walked for maybe 15 minutes, branches scraping my arms, roots trying to trip me. The signal stayed at the same distance, like it was moving with me. That should have been my first real warning, but adrenaline has a way of drowning out logic. I called out several times, asked if anyone could hear me, told them I was coming to help. Nothing answered except my own voice bouncing back through the trees. The terrain got rougher. I was off any trail now, scrambling over fallen logs, pushing through undergrowth that caught at my clothes. And still, that beacon kept its distance, always just far enough ahead to pull me forward. After another 20 minutes, I stopped. Something felt wrong. If someone was injured, they wouldn't be moving. If they were mobile enough to walk, they wouldn't need to keep their beacon active. Unless they wanted to be followed. That thought hit me like cold water. I stood there, breathing hard, and realized the beeping had stopped. Complete silence. Not even wind. I swept my headlamp in a slow circle, and that's when I saw it. Hanging from a pine branch about 7 feet up, a personal locator beacon. Still warm when I touched it. The activation tab had been pulled recently. I could see the safety seal on the ground beneath it, and there was blood on the casing. Fresh enough to still be tacky. My hands started shaking. This wasn't someone's accident. Someone had deliberately activated this beacon, hung it here, and used it to draw me nearly a mile from my camp. I ran. Didn't think, just ran, crashing back through the darkness the way I'd come. My headlamp bounced wildly, showing me nothing useful, just fragments of trees and shadow. I kept expecting to run into whoever had set this up, kept waiting for something to grab me from the dark. When I finally burst back into my clearing, I went straight for my pack. My beacon was gone. I tore through every pocket, dumped everything out onto the ground. It wasn't there. Someone had been in my camp while I was gone, had taken my only way to call for help. I spent the rest of that night backed against a tree, knife in hand, staring into the darkness. Every sound felt like a threat. Every shadow looked like movement. When dawn finally broke, I started packing. That's when I noticed something I'd missed in my panic the night before. My tent zipper was open. Not the way I'd left it, but pulled from the outside. And sitting on top of my sleeping bag, placed deliberately where I'd see it, was a Polaroid photograph. It showed my campsite, taken from the woods, maybe 30 feet back. The timestamp in the corner read 11:47 p.m., right when I'd been chasing that beacon. But it was what was in the photo that made my hands go numb. My tent was lit from within by my headlamp, the one I thought I'd taken with me. And there was a silhouette inside. Someone hunched over my gear, going through my things. I flipped the photo over. Written on the back in neat handwriting, "You should have stayed." I grabbed what I could carry and got out of there. Hiked faster than I ever have, didn't stop until I reached the trailhead. Reported everything to the rangers, gave them the photo, told them about the beacon, the blood, all of it. They searched for 2 days. Found the beacon I'd described, still hanging from that tree. Confirmed the blood was human, but it didn't match anyone in their missing persons database. What they didn't find was any evidence of another person. No prints, no DNA, no gear. Nothing. But here's the part that haunts me more than anything else. 3 months later, I was going through my camera roll, deleting old photos. I found one I didn't take. It was buried in my gallery, time-stamped from that trip, from 3:47 a.m., while I was awake, holding my knife, staring into the darkness. The photo was taken from behind me, close enough to touch, and in the edge of the frame, you can see my missing beacon, hanging from someone's hand. I never went back to those woods, and I'm never camping alone again, because whoever took that photo, they're still out there, and they still have my beacon. After finding that photo on my camera, I couldn't let it go. The rangers had closed the case, called it inconclusive, but I knew someone had been out there with me, someone who'd gotten close enough to take that picture while I sat there, completely unaware. I started digging, looked into other camping incidents in that area, scrolled through forums about wilderness horror stories and scary camping experiences. That's when I found it, a post from 2 years earlier. A hiker describing almost the exact same thing, a distress beacon that moved, leading them away from camp. They'd found their own beacon missing when they returned, but they'd also found something else. A note that said, "Next time, bring a friend." I reached out to them. They responded within hours. Turns out, there were 5 others. 5 people over 3 years, all experiencing variations of the same terrifying camping experience. All solo hikers, all in the Cascades. And every single one had their beacon stolen. We compared notes, shared our stories. The pattern was clear, but so was something else. None of us had been hurt. Scared, sure. Traumatized, absolutely. But whoever was doing this never physically harmed anyone. They just watched, studied us, collected our beacons like trophies. One of the group, a former SAR volunteer, had a theory. She thought it might be someone who'd had a bad experience in the wilderness, maybe lost someone they couldn't save. Someone now obsessed with emergency preparedness, testing whether people would help a stranger in distress, or maybe punishing those who camp alone. We never found out who it was. The incident stopped after our group went public with our experiences. Maybe the attention scared them off. Maybe they moved to different woods. But sometimes late at night, I think about that photo, about how close they were, about how they could have done anything to me, but chose not to. And I don't know if that makes it better or worse, because the scariest part of real camping horror stories isn't always what happens. Sometimes it's knowing what could have. This happened to me last April, deep in the Ozark backcountry. I'm only sharing this because the alternative is keeping it inside, and that's been eating me alive for 8 months now. I'd been solo camping for years. Never had an issue. The trail I picked was a standard loop. 8 miles total. Camp at the halfway point, finish the circuit the next day. I'd done harder routes a dozen times. The hiking took about 3 hours. I made camp near a small creek, set up my tent on flat ground about 20 yards from the water, built a fire, ate dinner, watched the sun drop behind the ridge. Everything felt normal. Safe even. I slept hard. Woke up at first light feeling rested. Packed my gear methodically. Tent rolled tight, sleeping bag compressed, everything back in my pack by 7:30. I kicked dirt over the fire pit until the ashes were buried. Made sure I hadn't left any trash. The area looked untouched. The trail marker pointed west. The second half of the loop. 4 miles to the parking lot. I started walking. The first hour was easy. Gentle downhill grade, well-marked path. I passed a distinctive rock formation, this weird cluster of boulders stacked at an odd angle. Made a mental note of it. By hour 2, I should have been close to the parking lot. The trail guide said 4 miles. I'm not fast, but I'm consistent. 3 miles an hour on easy terrain. But the forest just kept going. I checked my phone. The signal was a bit poor, which was expected. But my GPS app showed my last location and it didn't make sense. I was still 3 miles from the trailhead. I'd been walking for 2 hours. Maybe I was slower than I thought. I kept going. Another hour passed. The trail stayed consistent. Same width. Same yellow blazes on the trees every 100 yards. But I hadn't gained any distance according to my GPS. I stopped and really studied my surroundings. Pulled out my paper map. The trail was a simple loop. There were no offshoots. No alternate paths. Just one continuous circuit. I'd somehow been walking for 3 hours and made no progress. That's when I started to feel it. Not panic, not yet. But something close. A tightness in my lungs that had nothing to do with exertion. I picked up my pace. Walked faster. The GPS on my phone kept refreshing. The little blue dot that represented me barely moved. Then I saw the rock formation again. The same stacked boulders. Same odd angle. Same lichen pattern on the north face. I'd walked in a complete circle. But that was impossible. The trail hadn't curved. I'd been watching for turns. It had been straight the entire time. I stood there trying to reason through it. Maybe the GPS was glitching. Maybe the map was wrong. Maybe there was a loop within the loop that wasn't marked. I walked past the rocks and kept going. Checked my watch every 10 minutes. Watched the trees. Counted my steps. 45 minutes later, I saw them again. The same rocks. I'd circled back somehow. The trail had to be curving gradually, too gradually for me to notice. That was the only explanation. I pulled out my compass. Started walking with it in my hand, making sure I stayed on a western heading. The trail bent slightly north, then corrected south, but overall I was moving west. Toward the parking lot. Toward my truck. An hour later, the rocks appeared ahead of me. I actually stopped breathing for a second. Just stood there staring at them. This wasn't possible. I walked up to the formation and studied it closely, looking for any difference. Any sign that this was a similar formation, not the same one. But there was a spot where I'd scraped my boot earlier. A fresh mark on the moss. And when I looked down, I saw my boot prints in a patch of soft dirt. Multiple sets of my boot prints. Overlapping. From different times. I'd been here 4 times now. My hands started shaking. I sat down on one of the rocks and forced myself to think clearly. The trail was doing something wrong. The markers were leading me in circles. I needed to leave the trail. Just pick a direction and bushwhack straight through the forest until I hit a road or a stream or something. I checked my compass, chose due west, started walking. No trail, just dense forest. I pushed through underbrush, climbed over fallen trees, navigated around thick stands of saplings. It was slow going, but at least I was going. At least I was moving away from that trail. I walked for an hour, maybe more. My jacket snagged on branches. My boots sank into soft ground. I was making progress. I had to be. Then the trees opened up. I stepped into a clearing. My campsite. Not a clearing that looked like my campsite. My campsite. The exact spot where I'd slept. I recognized the stones around the old fire pit. The slight depression in the ground where my tent had been. But I'd left this place 6 hours ago, and I'd been walking west the entire time. I spun around. The forest looked the same in every direction. Dense. Dark. No trail visible. I started walking again. Faster this time. Northeast. A different direction. I didn't care about the compass anymore. I just needed to get out. 30 minutes later, I was back at the clearing. I tried south. Found the clearing. I tried north. Found the clearing. Every direction led back to the same spot. The sun was starting to set. I'd been walking for almost 10 hours. My water was getting low. I had food for one more day, maybe 2 if I rationed. I couldn't spend another night here. I couldn't. I chose a direction at random and ran. Just flat out ran. Didn't care about the noise I was making or the branches hitting my face. I ran until my legs gave out. When I stopped, gasping, I was standing in the clearing again. The fire pit was right in front of me. Something broke in my mind then. I screamed. Actually screamed into the empty forest. Picked up rocks and threw them into the trees. Kicked at the fire pit until my boots hurt. When I finally stopped, exhausted, I noticed something. The ashes in the fire pit were warm. Not hot, not smoking, but warm. I hadn't built a fire this morning. I'd buried cold ashes from last night's fire. I knelt down and touched them. Definitely warm, like someone had been here an hour ago. I stood up slowly and looked around the clearing. Really looked. There were footprints everywhere. Boot prints. My size. My tread pattern. But there were too many of them. Dozens. Hundreds maybe. All overlapping. And they all led to the same spot. The trail entrance. I walked over to it. The yellow blaze on the tree was faded but visible. The path led into the forest, same as it had this morning. I started down it one more time. Not because I thought it would work, but because I was out of options. The sun dropped below the horizon. The forest went dark. I pulled out my headlamp and kept walking. I walked all night, past the rock formation 11 more times. Maybe 12. I stopped counting. When dawn came, I was still walking. My feet were numb. My water was gone. I'd stopped sweating hours ago, which I knew was a bad sign. Then the trail ended. Just ended. I stepped out onto pavement. A highway. Cars rushing past. I stood on the shoulder, swaying, trying to understand what had happened. A minivan pulled over. A woman got out and asked if I needed help. Called 911 when she saw the state I was in. The EMTs said I was severely dehydrated. Disoriented. They asked how long I'd been lost. I told them one day. They looked at each other but didn't argue. The police found my truck at the trailhead. Gave me a ride back to it. Asked if I wanted to file a report. I said no, because what would I even say? I drove home and tried to forget about it. Told myself it was dehydration, heat exhaustion, some kind of mental break. After 5 days, I got a call from the Forest Service. They found some of my gear on the trail. My tent, my sleeping bag. Asked if I wanted it back. I said yes. When I opened the bag they sent, everything was there. But there was something extra. A second sleeping bag, identical to mine, and a second tent, and a second set of boots. All used. All with my wear patterns. I don't know what that trail is. I don't know what it does to people. But I keep thinking about those boot prints. All those overlapping prints leading to the trail entrance. How many times had someone walked that loop before me? How many times had they tried to leave? And the question that I can't stop asking. When I finally made it out, was I the first one? I threw the extra gear in a dumpster behind a gas station 2 towns over. Didn't want it in my apartment. Didn't want to look at it. For 2 months, I tried to move on. Tried to convince myself it was dehydration, exhaustion, something explainable. Then I got a call from a ranger I'd never met. Said he'd been going through old missing persons reports. 3 hikers had disappeared on that trail over the past decade. Different years, different seasons, all solo campers. All reported the same thing before they vanished. They'd called loved ones saying they were stuck on a loop, that the trail wouldn't let them leave. Everyone assumed they were disoriented, dehydrated. By the time search parties went out, there was no trace. The ranger told me I was lucky. Said whatever happened to me, I'd somehow broken out of it. But here's what he didn't know. About 6 months after my horrifying camping experience, I was buying groceries and saw someone in the parking lot. He was loading camping gear into his truck. Our eyes met for a second. He had the same hollow look I'd seen in my mirror for months. That exhausted, confused expression of someone who'd been walking too long. I watched him drive away. Watched him turn toward the highway that leads to the Ozarks. I see them sometimes now. In coffee shops. At gas stations. Always alone. Always with that same haunted look. People who've walked trails that don't end. And I wonder how many of us made it out. How many are still out there walking in circles, trying to find an exit that keeps moving. The ranger asked if I'd ever go back to identify the trail. Help them close it down. I told him no. Because deep down, I'm terrified of what I'd find. Not the trail itself, but all the versions of me still trying to leave it. If you made it this far, you're already part of the Grave Hour. Tap subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss when the next nightmare drops.